Bienvenue. I'm Catherine Simon, Division Manager of Customer Experience at Ottawa Public Library. It is my pleasure to be here with you this evening. Koe kakina. Hello, everyone. We believe it is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people, now live, work, and study in this territory. Nous rendons hommage à toutes les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis, leurs aînés, leurs ancêtres et leurs importantes contributions passées et présentes. Happy Library Month. This October, OPL is focusing on the theme of friendship and asking all of you who enjoy the remarkable collections and resources of the library to urge a friend to sign up for a library card. It's free, of course, and new customers this month will receive a useful USB friendship bracelet, as will the friend who referred them. This evening, I want to thank the library's partner in this event, the Ottawa International Writers Festival, for bringing us such a wonderful array of authors to enjoy this fall. Tonight, we welcome Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges to talk about The Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison, a haunting and powerfully moving book. Apart from being a prolific writer and renowned public intellectual, Chris Hedges was ordained as a Presbyterian minister to work in prison ministry and has taught in New Jersey prisons in the college degree program offered by Rutgers University. The Class takes us behind those prison walls, behind the profit-driven industrial prison complex, to reveal the people that prisoners are and show us why criminal justice reform is so essential. You will soon be able to borrow The Class at an Ottawa Public Library branch near you. In the meantime, check out some of Chris Hedges' other bestsellers, such as Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and Empire of Illusion, and many more. Coming up on Wednesday evening at 6 p.m., we hope you will join us for the 2021 Ottawa Book Awards. Since 1985, the Ottawa Book Awards have recognized the top English and French books by local authors published in the previous year. This virtual award ceremony will be streamed on Ottawa Public Library's Facebook page. And of course, as a reminder, please visit the OPL website to find out about other upcoming programs and to access the wide range of content and resources that comes with the library card. It is now my pleasure to introduce Neil Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Thank you et bonne soirée.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. It's always a real treat to be working with our partners at the OPL on so many wonderful events, and happy Library Month. I must note that I'm also broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin. We recognize our obligation as settlers to work to repair the harms perpetuated upon Indigenous communities and acknowledge the ongoing trauma colonialism has inflicted and continues to inflict on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I want to begin by thanking you for supporting authors and booksellers throughout this pandemic. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, and I know that there is an independent bookseller near you who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. The Writers' Festival is supported by generous individuals like you, so I hope you'll consider making a donation. We can't do this without you. Just a reminder, tomorrow, Tuesday, at 7:30 p.m., we are honored to present the launch of Hunting by Stars, the long-awaited sequel to The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline, hosted by CBC's Sheila Rogers, followed by, as Catherine noted, the Ottawa Book Awards on Wednesday night. We're thrilled to note this is Chris Hedges' fourth appearance with the Ottawa International Writers Festival, and our host tonight is CBC's Adrian Harewood, anchor of the local news on CBC, and Adrian has also moderated some of our best and most popular podcasts. I would highly recommend his conversations with Miriam Sonchi and Youssef Salam from this season. Adrian is also teaching and mentoring the next generation of journalists at Carleton University. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, Adrian Harewood.
Well, thank you so much, Neil, for that very, very generous and kind introduction. It's always a delight to be here as part of these kinds of events with the Ottawa Public Library and, of course, the Ottawa Writers Festival. I really want to pay tribute to the work of the festival and also the library. These are two institutions that need to be supported. I think many of us have realized or recognized or been reminded of the importance of libraries, reminded of the importance of cultural institutions like the Writers Festival during COVID, which has been a tough time. But we know that books have provided many of us with solace. They provided us with some joy. They've provided us with a bit of a respite, from the challenges that many of us face in our lives, and whether it's the challenges that we face at home or at work. And so I really hope that all of us in the city will continue to support the Writers Festival, in particular, an independent institution that's been around for decades now and is really a cornerstone, a pillar in this community. And so certainly something that we should be paying attention to and investing and reinvesting in. Our guest this evening is Chris Hedges, and Chris still has not arrived yet. He will be coming very, very soon. We're looking forward to chatting with him for the next hour about his latest book. What I thought I would do is just tell you a little bit about Chris, to give you a bit of background information, tell you his biography, and then we're hoping that Chris will arrive momentarily. Of course, he is an incredibly busy fellow. Not only does he write books for a living, he also teaches. He's a prolific teacher, not just in the prison system, but he's taught at places like Princeton, and he's taught at Columbia as well. But he also has a television show, and so I suspect that maybe he's still on that show right now. maybe he's just finishing off the segment. But he has a show called On Contact, which is an Emmy-nominated program of which he is the host. Chris Hedges is an award-winning journalist, a best-selling author, and one of the foremost public intellectuals of our time. Chris is a former foreign correspondent. He worked in conflict zones around the world, places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. He worked in Central America in the 1980s. At the time, he was working with the Dallas Morning News. He became the Middle East bureau chief for the Dallas Morning News in the late 1980s. In 1995, he became the Balkan bureau chief for the New York Times, and he was based in Sarajevo at the time when that stricken city was being bombarded, and Chris was in the thick of it. He also covered the awful Srebrenica massacre. Thousands of Muslims were murdered during that terrible moment. In 2002, Chris was part of the New York Times investigative team that won the Pulitzer Prize. He would leave the New York Times in 2005, and Chris went on to, write books. He's the author of numerous books, including War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America, Death of the Liberal Class, and Wages of Rebellion, the Moral Imperative of Revolt. Chris's latest book is called The Class: Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. The book chronicles his time as a teacher in the New Jersey prison system and tells the story of the 28 incarcerated students that he teaches in the maximum security prison and their intellectual and emotional journey, reading the plays of some of the world's greatest playwrights, and then composing a play of their own, a play that they ended up writing. This is a really powerful book. I've been reading the book, and as you can tell, I have a lot of notes, and that's because Chris, of course, as usual, has a lot to say. This is a very, very intimate book where he basically profiles the lives of these individuals, all of whom are men, all of whom have various stories as to how they arrived in that place, in the prison. And Chris does a remarkable job of really mining their lives, of telling their stories, talking about the trauma that many endured. And in many ways, Chris is the perfect person to write a book like that, because as someone who has spent so much time in conflict zones over his many years as a journalist, this book is about the conflict zone that is urban America, the conflict zone from which, many of these people have emerged. Chris does a remarkable job of telling the story of the deindustrialization, for example, of the United States, and the impact that it's had now on generations of folks, the devastation that it has wrought in the neighborhoods of the US. He talks about, for example, the crime bill that we saw that came about in 1994 that was sponsored by Bill Clinton and the Democrats. And he really, he really goes after Clinton and goes after the Democrats for what he regards as being one of the most regressive social policies, which was the crime bill, the $30 billion bill that has resulted in a huge explosion in the prison population in the United States. He talks about just the lack of hope, the lack of opportunity that many of these people that he teaches in the prison system have had. And so he talks about how they are the refuse. They have been kind of cast aside, and they've been left to kind of fend for themselves. Many of them, coming from families which have been devastated by, whether it has been various health crises, whether it's been the drug crises that has kind of wreaked such havoc in so many families across the United States. And so this book is really Chris's attempt to explain the conditions in which now, some 2 million people are subjected to in America's prison system. We learn, of course, that prison system has really expanded over the last number of years. I think it was in 1980, the number of people who were in prisons for drug offenses was some 41,000 people. And then, fast forward to today, and Chris notes that there are some 500,000 people who are in prison as a result of drug offenses. And so, again, this is Chris's attempt to explain how this prison system has come to be. So right now, what time is it right now? It's about 7:45, and we're just hoping that Chris Hedges will be coming to join us very, very soon. He's currently based in New York City, in Princeton, New York. Sorry, not Princeton, New York, in Princeton, New Jersey, my apologies. So that's where he is based. But Chris also has a long-standing connection with this country, Canada. He's lived at times in this country. His wife, Eunice, who is an actress, is a Canadian as well. And of course, he has long-standing relationships with things like the Writers' Festival. Neil was mentioning that he's participated in Writers' Festival events on 4 different occasions. So we're just hoping that Chris Hedges will be joining us momentarily, of course, to talk about this book here, The Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. And so, in the book, Chris talks about the process that his students take in actually composing a play. But before they get there, they end up reading some of the great playwrights of the 20th century. One of the playwrights that the students read is August Wilson, and his seminal play Fences, plays a very, very important part in their education. We also see that his students get an opportunity to read Amiri Baraka's Dutchman, that play that caused such a sensation, really, when it was released in the 1960s. And so he kind of goes through their own evolution, their own development, their own appreciation for literature, and the impact that this process has on them. But it's not just the students that are affected, it's Chris himself. You know, Chris talks about how much he appreciates the opportunity to teach these students, whom he says are, you know, better than many of the, much better than many of the Ivy League students that he's taught for years, the Ivy League students that he's taught at places like Columbia, at places like Princeton, because he believes that, he says that you know, these students have a kind of imagination and a kind of curiosity that he has not encountered in those Ivy League students. And, you know, in these Ivy League schools, I should say, you know, I was watching an interview that Chris conducted, that Chris did a couple of months ago. And he was asked by the interviewer, where is the next Malcolm X? That was the question. Where is the next Malcolm X in the United States? And Chris responded, well, the next Malcolm X is in prison. You know, he said that the ability, the capacity, the desire for of these students that he has in prison, their desire to improve themselves, their desire to learn, their hunger for literature, their hunger for books, you know, makes them, you know, quite remarkable students. And so he marvels at their ability, but he also laments the fact that they are not free, of course, and they are unable to, you know, share their talents with many other members of the community. You know, one of the highlights of the book, and I'm hoping that when Chris arrives, he will be able to talk about this, but one of the highlights of the book, of course, is towards the end, when this play, Caged, which has been written by all 28 of these incarcerated folks, when this play is finally staged, it's staged inside the prison. And two of the people that Chris invites are Cornel West, one of the leading, you know, again, one of the leading intellectuals of his generation, of our era, former professor at Harvard University and also professor at Princeton University. And another person who showed up was the late James Cone, a remarkable theologian. And both of those individuals, you know, they come for the staging of this play, and it's so meaningful. You know, the students are so moved at the fact that these towering intellectuals have felt it important enough to spend, you know, a good chunk of time listening to them, and the fact that they are being recognized, that they are that folks are listening to them, that are listening to their story. Folks value what they have to say. It's overwhelming. It means so much to them. It's, you know, some of the incarcerated folks talk about what a gift it is to be in the presence of someone like Cornel West and James Cone. But the truth also is that Cone and West are also very much affected by the experience. James Cone says that you know, he could very well have been ended up in the prison, and so James Cone himself identifies very much with the struggles that these people have had to endure. He admires their resilience and admires their willingness to get out of their comfort zones and to challenge themselves. And so James Cone is also very much moved by this experience. And Cornel West, of course, the always articulate, always eloquent Cornel West, doesn't disappoint, and he really captivates the audience. But as I said, Cornel West himself is very, very much moved as well. Just kind of looking at the time now, it's 10 minutes to 8. And as I mentioned, we are here just waiting for Chris Hedges, who is our guest tonight. Chris, just to remind you, is the author of Class, or The Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. Just a few tidbits about Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges himself, as we mentioned at the beginning, is an ordained minister, Presbyterian minister. His father as well was a minister. His father, who passed away in 1995, and someone who, of course, had such an important role in as a model for Chris, someone who very much inspired him. And Chris speaks about his father, often. But Chris was born in Vermont, and he went to school in Connecticut. Actually, he attended, I think it's called the Loomis Chaffee School. Loomis Chaffee School, and oh, let me remind myself of where that school is. It's 7 miles. That's right. It's Windsor, Connecticut. So it's a school that's, I think, 7 miles outside of Hartford. And Loomis Chaffee is actually one of the kind of elite private schools in the United States. And then that's the school that Chris Hedges attended. But he was a little bit of a rebel while he was there. And I understand that because of his work at the newspaper at that particular school, he was actually put on probation. And so that was one of the things that I was hoping to ask him about. I was hoping to ask him, how he got to here, how, someone who attended, some of the elite institutions in the country, whether it was Loomis Chaffee School, where he went to high school, but then he also attended Colgate University, and he later attended the Harvard Divinity School. So, Chris is the product of some of the top educational institutions in the country. And yet he has chosen, in a very, very intentional way, to teach in prisons. He has been very intentional in trying to align himself with the most marginalized in the society. He has aligned himself with the poor and the downtrodden. And Chris very much believes that we learn about conscience through our connection with those who suffer. And so for him, his engagement with the too many of the people who have been left behind in this society is what he needs to be doing, is what he should be doing. It's part of his kind of engagement with the world. So let's just see where we are. Okay, we are 7 minutes to 8 o'clock, and I'm just being told that unfortunately it looks as if, okay, are we going to give it a couple more minutes? Okay, I'm just reading here. I'm just getting a note here from our coordinator, and apparently they have not received a call from Chris yet. And so the suggestion is that we try and wind things down at 8 o'clock if he doesn't arrive. So let me just go over some of the things that I wanted to talk about today. One of the questions I wanted to ask Chris was, I wanted to ask him to kind of give us a brief history of how the prison system emerged in the United States, because of course we know that the prison system didn't always exist. And so I wanted to ask him about the initial purpose of the prison. Wanted to ask him also about who were the original inmates. What was the prison for? We know that, for example, before the Civil War, the vast majority of people in American prisons were white. Almost all of them were white, and that's because Black folks, African Americans, were enslaved at that moment, and so they weren't really part of the original, shall we say, prison system in the United States. So those were some of the questions that I was hoping to ask him. One of the things that I was really intrigued by was just Chris's ability to gain the trust of the incarcerated men that he works with, because that's not an easy feat. As I mentioned, Chris is someone who worked for the New York Times. He is someone who went to Harvard University. He is a white man, and he's going into prison, and he is going to teach, 28 Black men who have a very, very different kind of background, very, very different kind of history than him. These men are suspicious of outsiders. They're suspicious of do-gooders. And of course, upon seeing Chris for the first time, they're wondering who this person is, and they're wondering what he wants and why he's there. And so Chris has to figure out how to earn their trust, how to make them feel as if they can take some chances, and that they can allow themselves to be vulnerable. So much of this process is about vulnerability and allowing oneself to kind of be free. And over the course of the time that Chris teaches these students end up divulging a lot of very, very difficult information. They end up sharing a lot of really tough stories about some of the abuse that they suffered at home. They talk also about some of their transgressions, and the many regrets that they have. They talk about how they have caused others trauma, and the hurt and harm that they have caused. So that they have been hurt, but they have also hurt others. And Chris takes them along this journey. And so I was really curious as to, how Chris went about developing that kind of trust, how he was able to develop that bond. Because again, over the course of the book, these students take tremendous risks. What I will say is that, of course, by the end of the book, this is really a family. And when the play is done, there is there's real emotion there when they're saying goodbye to each other, that the class is done, and there's a sense of loss because this community that Chris and the students have managed to create together over the course of the many weeks that they are engaged in creating this play has been an unforgettable moment. An unforgettable experience for them. And so, they have real connections at the end of this. So that was one thing that I was really, really curious about. I wanted to kind of understand how Chris was able to do that. I was curious about some of the mistakes that he made, some of the errors he made, some of his own regrets. And also wanted to hear a little bit more about what has happened, whether he's been able to maintain a connection, whether he maintains, active communication with the students with whom he worked over those many, many months. And there was one quote that he said that I found, really powerful. He said, Chris is talking about art, and he says, the role of art is transcendence, creating the capacity for empathy, especially for those who appear strange, foreign, or different. And I was just really struck at how Chris, used the instrument that is theater, drama, to engage in this process. And there's something about studying theater, something about playwriting, something about reading plays that provides a certain kind of space, a certain kind of opportunity for these students to mind their own interior selves, to kind of better understand themselves. And with someone who is as brilliant a writer and observer of the human condition, like August Wilson, and his fabulous play Fences, through the experience of reading that play, many of these students are they remark on this. They say that they feel as if they're reading about their own lives. They feel as if they could have written this play. The horrors, the joys, the disappointments, all of the many aspects of life that Wilson manages to cover in that remarkable play of his. It really has a tremendous effect on these students, and it forces them to reflect on their own choices in life, and that's what makes it such a powerful experience and such a potent instrument. And Chris, clearly recognizes the power of plays, the power of theater. Well, I'm just looking here at the time, and it is 8 o'clock, and I'm being told that Chris Hedges is trying to arrive. So what that suggests to me is that he will be arriving momentarily. And I look here and I see that 38 of you are still here. So thank you so much for keeping the faith. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We started some 31 minutes ago, and I think we had about 41 people. So only three people have dropped off. And so we're still managing to hold on. So if you can stick with us for a couple more minutes, we're hoping that Chris Hedges will be able to join us, and you will certainly be rewarded for your patience tonight and your willingness to stick with us and to invest some of your time. And I'm seeing that Chris is actually here.
Yeah, I had trouble with whatever the Zoom link was. It wasn't letting me in. I apologize.
No problem. No, it's wonderful to see you, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us. I've been
Sure.
to use a kind of Canadian term. I've been ragging the puck, like a Rod Gilbert.
That's right. My wife's Canadian. I know like a few.
Yeah,
of those
Rod Gilbert from the old New York Rangers. Maybe you were a Rangers fan back in the day, or Jean Rattel.
There you go.
That's what I was trying to do the last couple of minutes. So Chris, what I kind of did was I already introduced you to our audience. So what I thought I would do was just maybe the first question being, this book of yours, The Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. I'm just curious as to why you wanted to write this book. What's the genesis of the book?
So the genesis of the book was kind of like the genesis of the play that I had this class write in East Jersey State Prison. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't organic. It was organic. And so in the book, I'm teaching drama, August Wilson, Amira Baraka. I took John Herbert's play, Miguel Pinera and others. And the students, 28 students, most of them were not familiar with dramatic form. So I had them just each week write out scenes from their lives that were autobiographical in dialogue. And what I didn't know is that one of the students, Kabir, that in Arabic that means big, that's his nickname, and the guy's big, knew who I was, had heard me on the Pacifica station, and recruited all of the best writers in the prison. So when I brought those first scenes home, I had about a half dozen that were quite striking. And this happened after several weeks, 2-3 weeks. And so I showed them to my wife, who is Canadian, went to Juilliard as a professional actor, and decided that I would help them cobble together a play, which ended up being Caged, about their lives. So I stumbled into it. And what happened is that people were writing out of their own trauma, out of their own suffering, and expressing pain and talking about incidents that they had never spoken about to people they'd been in prison with, sometimes for decades. It got very emotional and it was a very powerful experience. We ended up producing the play. It ended up getting run by the Professional Theater in Trenton, Passage Theater, was published by Haymarket, but all of it. And so the book was kind of like that, in that that was 2013, and gradually my students got out, And just because of that emotional bonds that all of us had created in that classroom, I was often at the gate to meet them, and I was able to follow over the course of the next 8 years what happened to their lives. Some of which, I have just one of my, well, Kabir. I mean, for example, 2 years is still homeless. He doesn't have a place to live. Was in a shelter. He can't get a job. Others have done well. I mean, and so I decided to write the book. I wanted to write a book on prisons for some time, but there are a lot of good books out there. And I think I needed that gestation, that period, because I'm writing about characters. I pick about a half dozen characters to write about in depth, to put a kind of human face on mass incarceration. So that's how it happened. But it was, almost a decade process.
Talk about the play or drama or theater as a pedagogical instrument. I'm curious as to why you felt that this was the instrument that you could use to kind of unlock the class. What is it about it?
Well, it's like August Wilson in his great play Joe Turner, Come and Gone. So this is a play. It's set in 10-year cycles. This one's set in the early 1900s in a boarding house in Pittsburgh. All the plays take place in Pittsburgh, and it's about blacks who are coming up from the South, having survived the terror of Jim Crow and convict leasing. So after the Civil War, after emancipation, you had a system of convict leasing whereby blacks would be picked up for non-crimes, not very similar to today, vagrancy, this kind of stuff, and could be sold off for a fee. Plantation owners could buy these prisoners, and they would serve terms often for years, 7 years. It was actually worse than slavery because these plantation owners, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, by the way, who was the largest slave trader in the South before the Civil War, was a Civil War general, was working his plantations after the Civil War with hundreds of convicts. The convicts,
Forrest, of course, from the KKK.
Yes, and he founded the KKK. There you go. And there's a big statue. There was to him in Memphis last time I was there. So you had because they weren't paying for. I mean, these human bodies were not bodies that they had to pay for. They were actually treated far worse, and the mortality rates are. We don't have real numbers, but very high, especially in places like the Turpentine camps in northern Florida. I mean, they would go in chains and coffles. So these are 40 men all chained together, and never came out. And so August Wilson writes this play about somebody who was enslaved for 7 years as a convict, and then he comes north to Pittsburgh to try and find his wife. And there's a conjurer in there who keeps telling him that in order to be a whole person, he has to find his song, which means he has to recognize his own history, his own past, his own suffering, and give expression to it, give words to it. And that's what happened in that classroom. They gave words to their own narrative. We can't know who we are if we don't know where we came from. And as one of my very talented students said, Boris Franklin, by the end of that class, we realized we all had the same song. We had the same story. It came in different variations. But if you're poor and black in America, there is enough commonality. And we didn't know that. And it was that process of breaking down those emotional walls, those emotional barriers were key. And that happened through the writing and through the courage of those in the class to express things they'd never expressed before. But all of it, again, was not planned. It wasn't, I was just going to teach drama, and I ended up kind of falling into this very magical, I would call it even sacred moment in this classroom.
Chris, I'm curious as to your own song, right? Because your journey, your song is quite different from the song of the incarcerated men that you're working with. I was mentioning to our audience earlier, you were born in Vermont. You grew up, outside of Albany in New York. You went to elite private schools You went to Loomis Chaffee School. You also went to Eaglebrook, I think, school. I think Loomis Chaffee is a school of Rockefellers attended
Yeah,
that
that's
school.
true.
You know,
John D. Rockefeller spoke
yeah,
at my high school graduation,
that's right. Salzburgers,
and the Salzburgers.
owners of the New York Times. Like I'm saying, you went to school with the elite, in the society. You went to Colgate University, another, esteemed university in the country. You attended Harvard, and yet you were drawn to the prison. You were drawn to, and this is a theme throughout your life. You're drawn to working and grounding, as Walter Rodney would say, grounding with your brothers, right? Of grounding yourself with the marginalized. Why are you so drawn to the prison?
Well, I think there's a kind of consistency to it, a continuity to it. So I did go to these schools, but I was a scholarship student. And when I went to Eaglebrook, which is a pre-prep school for the uber rich, I was one of 16 kids on scholarship. And I would go back, much of my mother's family is all from rural Maine, and working class, even lower working class. And that kind of schizophrenic existence between these two worlds, I saw that my grandfather, for instance, was quite highly intelligent, but he never finished high school. And he never finished high school because his senior year in high school, his sister's husband died, and he had to leave school and work the farm in order to feed the kids. So I was, I think made aware very early on that in America, if you're poor, you only get one chance, if you get any chance. Whereas if you're George W. Bush, who was a cocaine addict and everything else, went AWOL, you get chance after chance after chance. And so that was part of it. When I went to Harvard Divinity School, I lived in Roxbury, across the street from the Maine Mission Extension Housing Project. This was the most violent, dangerous housing project in the city, and commuted into Harvard. That gave me a perspective on Harvard. Cornell West once asked me, because I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years in all these war zones, what was the most impactful experience that I had? And I would say it was Roxbury, because I, as a white male who, you're right, lived in these privileged environments, had no idea how institutional racism works, how all of these institutions work to keep the poor poor. Probation officers, dysfunctional schools, police, and it really was a hugely important moment, because it allowed me for the first time to see how white supremacy functions, the actual mechanics of white supremacy. So, and I went from there to El Salvador. I did finish Harvard Divinity School, but I went to cover the war for 5 years. So I was in Salvador for 5 years, in the Middle East for 7 years. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia for 3 years. And all of these assignments were meant that some of them were quite dangerous. I was standing with those the great theologian James Cone calls the crucified of the earth. And so when I came back, this was consistent with everything that I had done overseas as a reporter. Although I will say that, again, I didn't go looking for it. My neighbor, Celia Chazelle, the chairman of the history department of the College of New Jersey at the time, was teaching in the prisons. There was no college program at that time. Now I teach through Rutgers, and they get their associates and their BA. But she was teaching college courses for people in the prison who had finished their high school equivalency, the GED, and she would buy the books, and of course it was unpaid. And then if they completed that semester work, she'd go home and print something off her computer that said that they had done that work, and it would go into their file, which helped in front of their parole boards. But they didn't get any academic credit, and that's how I started, because they needed professors. It was very hard. Even through Rutgers, it's hard to get professors because you're often not treated particularly well in the prison. It's at night. If you're a young adjunct professor, you're not going to get any kudos from your department by teaching in a prison. Your career is going to be determined by what you publish and peer-reviewed articles and all this kind of stuff. So, and then I just got kind of hooked. But I think that it wasn't completely foreign. And then I would also say, as somebody who'd spent so much time in war, I am quite familiar with the culture of violence. I carry my own trauma as a war correspondent. So there was a kind of commonality. In fact, a lot of these guys that I teach in prison remind me of war correspondents. They're very similar kind of characters.
You say in the book, we gain a conscience by building a relationship with those who suffer. These relationships place us within the circle of contamination. They force us to confront our own vulnerability. You also, reference Aristotle. You say Aristotle understood that virtue always entails actions. Those who do not act, Aristotle warns, those who are always asleep can never be virtuous. It does not matter what they profess. It's important for you to walk the talk.
Sure. I mean, I learned that from my father, who was a Presbyterian minister. I don't think you can teach morality. I think you illustrate it. To make a moral choice in life usually has a cost. If you truly stand with the oppressed, let's say in Sarajevo, you're going to get treated like the oppressed. By the time I got there, 45 foreign journalists had already been killed by the Serbs, who consciously, the Serb snipers were trying to take us down. A photographer I worked with was shot 3 days after I got there. 22 journalists were killed during the war in El Salvador. I think that it isn't what you profess. I mean, people can be quite pious and live. I think the best fictional kind of example of that is perhaps the opening of Moby Dick with the Quakers who own the Pequod. Skimping on with all their piety, skimping on the food to make money off of the sailors on the ship. And in my case of my father, he was a World War II veteran. He'd been in North Africa, but very outspoken against the Vietnam War, very supportive of the civil rights movement. We lived in an all-white farm town where Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. And then my father was very outspoken about GBLTQ rights, gay rights. His youngest brother was gay. And so my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 60s. And the church was very unforgiving for that. They didn't like the anti-war stuff. They didn't like the civil rights movement, but it was more tolerable because there were sections of the church that embraced those movements, but almost nobody embraced equality for GB. He was calling for marriage, ordination, and everything else. So, there was a cost. I mean, people walked out of his sermons. The institutional church turned on him, especially for his advocacy of gay rights. And I saw that. And as a kid, it was highly impactful. So I think that you're right, that it doesn't matter what you profess. It matters what you do. I mean, one of my closest friends covering the war in the Balkans was a member of Opus Dei. So, I mean, he was an admirer of Franco. And was eventually killed with my closest friend, Kurt Schork. But he was just loyal and fierce and wonderful. And it was, it didn't matter at that point. His heart was good. It didn't matter at that point, whatever, Catholicized, fascist, religious belief that he had.
You've said that mass incarceration is the civil rights issue of our time. Why is that the case?
Because, well, what happens is any time that there is an attempt on the part of blacks in the United States to rise up and demand justice and their own equality, the response of the state is to create carceral conditions, policing conditions that destroy that struggle for justice. That's what happened after Reconstruction in the South, with the whole terror of Jim Crow and the paramilitary groups like the White Leagues and the KKK, which Paxton, our great scholar on fascism, calls the KKK America's most authentically fascist movement. And then after the rise in the 1960s with Black Power groups, again, and especially the Attica prison uprising, Heather Thompson writes a very good book on this called Blood in the Water. You saw, again, the re-incarceration of black bodies. So 1970, you've got 300,000 people, disproportionately, of course, of color and almost all poor within the prison system. Now we have 2.3 million people incarcerated, and prisons function as plantations.
How did that happen, Chris?
Well, it happened.
How did that happen? Because you point to 1994 in particular, and that
Yeah.
crime bill as being particularly significant.
Yeah, that was Joe Biden and Bill Clinton who were trying to take back the law and order issue from the Republicans. And the way they did it was to militarize the police and massively expand mass incarceration. And then another important point is that they tripled and quadrupled sentences. So I always tell my students, I ask them, can you guess how many years Gabriel Princip got for assassinating the Archduke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife? He got 20. I've taught students who have life sentences and they never committed a violent crime. 40% of the people in the American prison system never physically harmed another person. I mean, Canada has much the same. I think 30% of your prison population are First Nations people. I mean, you have, and you go out to some of the, Alberta and those provinces, you're talking 50+%. It's the same with Black people in the United States. And so you deindustrialize these urban centers. There's no work. And so you rupture what Emile Durkheim calls these kind of social bonds. And what you do is your only two forms of social control then become militarized police and prisons. And until they live in communities where they can actualize themselves, find well-paying jobs with security and housing, then there will be no prison reform because you have to re-knit those social bonds. And of course, we're going rapidly in the other direction.
Chris, you know the argument that many Canadians will use and Americans will use. They'll say this. They'll say the prison protects us. The prison keeps our streets safe. The prison keeps our homes safe. The prison keeps violent criminals like Paul Bernardo away from us. It keeps serial killers away from us. We need the prison in order to preserve civilization.
Well, there certainly are people you don't walking the streets. I mean, I've taught some of them, but that's a mental health issue. And of course, the way they justify what takes place and the court systems in the United States are utterly dysfunctional. 94% of those people in the prison system never got a jury trial. They were coerced into pleading out. Is that you use that fear, you use that stereotype, you use the super predator. The fact is that many of my students had no option but to engage in the underground or the illegal economy because there was nothing for them. There comes a point when people in the house need to pay the rent. They need to buy food. We have, I'm speaking as an American, we have responded by creating a carceral society. We invest in mechanisms of control. We don't invest in people. And this is the consequence.
And you say that these people, these students that you're working with, are superior to many of the students you taught at Columbia or at Princeton. You say that they can run circles around the students at the Ivy League schools.
They can, because for two reasons. One, of course, there are intellectuals in every strata of society. I had relatives, and go back to my grandfather, who never finished high school, but had a kind of native intelligence that was never allowed to flourish or be developed. So that's true within the prison system. So my students turn their cells into libraries. And when you begin a discussion in a prison classroom, you have to remember they understand neoliberalism because they're victims of it. They understand police oppression, abuse, and militarized police because they're victims of it. They understand the nature of white supremacy because they're victims of it. So the level of discussion in those classrooms begins at a plateau that these kids in these elite universities can't reach. There was a couple years ago, the Bard College prison debate team debated Harvard and slaughtered them, which made kind of national news, but it wasn't a surprise to any of us who taught in the prison.
So what's the lesson to the rest of the society in that?
What are we to poverty is the greatest of all crimes, as George Bernard Shaw wrote in Major Barbara. All the other crimes are nothing compared to it. And so I have students who committed crimes, although I also have a lot of students who didn't commit the crime for which they're in. There's a large number of people who are coerced into pleading out or signing confessions for crimes they didn't commit. But but they're not criminals. The truly criminal behavior are the neoliberal architects who decided that through deindustrialization and programs of austerity, a huge segment of the population would be treated little better than human refuse. That's the real crime.
Yeah. And your students in the prison, they understood that their bodies are valuable to the political economy,
Yeah,
which is the prison industrial complex.
If they're in a cage, they're not worth anything on the street. But if you lock them in a cage, they can generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year.
Can you explain how that works, Chris? How does that work? Can you explain that?
Well, because prisons are privatized. I mean, you have private prisons, but that's a small percentage of prisons. But internally, state and federal prisons are all privatized because the functions have been taken over by corporations. So the medical is privatized, the food, Armart provides the food. I mean, a lot of it's rancid and there's constant food poisoning, but it's a private company. The money transfer, JPay is a private for-profit company. The phone service, Global Tel Link, is for-profit. And so this is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, and their lobbyists are the one in Washington who are making sure that the prison system stays as massive as it is and recidivism rates remain as high as they are. Within 5 years, 76% of those people released from American prisons return to prison. Because once they get out, they're thrown into a criminal caste system where they can't get work. They're denied the possibility of applying for all sorts of jobs. Basically, any job where you need a license, a hairdresser, a plumber, anything like that. They can't get public housing. They often leave prison with exorbitant fines. If they can't pay those fines back, they go right back to prison. So
they're basically stripped of their citizenship.
They can't vote, and a lot of them can't even vote. So yes, they are thrown into a caste system. That's not new in America. There's something very protean about white supremacy in the United States, and that it always changes its form or its outward shape, but not its core. So prisons are run like plantations. You pay in New Jersey, they get $28 a month. They work 40 hours a week. That's roughly 22 cents an hour. States like Georgia, they don't get paid at all. And the prisons can't function. The prisoners do everything. I used to walk past the guard's barber shop, and there'd be prisoners in barber uniforms. Everything is done, and then you have 1 million, almost half the prison population in the United States works for-profit corporations. These are sweatshops. McDonald's makes its uniforms in prisons because, why pay Bangladeshis 22 cents an hour when you can pay prisoners in a prison 22 cents an hour? They can't organize. They can't protest their working conditions. If they're sick, you don't have to pay sick time. If they're a problem, you send them off to the isolation unit. Yeah.
How do you understand prison abolition? And would you describe yourself as a prison abolitionist?
Yeah, I would. I mean, again, there are people who are a danger to themselves and danger to society without that. And in fact, within a prison, I'm talking about real killers. Most of the rest of the prison population is quite wary of them and kind of keeps their distance from them. So, but that, again, that's a mental health issue. If you bring people into a system and who already have endured because of poverty and what it is that they have lived on the streets of American cities, tremendous amounts of trauma, and then you traumatize them even further, you're not actually assisting them in terms of reintegrating themselves into society. It's why I'm such a strong supporter of prison education. But all of these programs have been wiped out, courtesy of prison lobbyists. Social workers are gone. Most of the programs are gone. The state doesn't fund a lot of these education programs. They're funded through grants, or they're funded through universities that kind of reach out into the prison system. So, the problem is you warehouse these people who already have tremendous amount of trauma, and you add to that trauma. There should be a restorative process. If you are going to bring people in, you should do everything within your power to make sure that when they walk out, they're equipped. And that, of course, includes the ability to find employment. They're equipped to reintegrate within society. And of course, we do the opposite.
One of the high points of the book, of course, is when two of your, can I describe them as heroes, James Cone and
Oh
Cornel
yeah,
West,
sure.
two heroes of yours, where they show up for you. You know, they have your back, basically. They show up to the play and they captivate those your students. But they themselves are also very much moved by that. Can you just talk about what that experience was like for you, witnessing your two friends, you know, engaging with your students inside the prison?
Well, we couldn't perform the play because there were parts of the play that would have angered the Department of Corrections. And so I invited Cornell and James Cone, the great theologian, to come in and be our audience, which of course the students were like beside themselves. They were ecstatic. And I mean, Cornell's Cornell. Many people know him. He's just wonderful and charismatic. And
Tell us
really,
what makes Cornell Cornell. For those who might not be familiar with Cornell West, what makes him Cornell?
well, there's two things that make him Cornell. One, he's probably one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met. I am fortunate in that I knew Susan Sontag, I know Noam Chomsky, and I know Cornell West, and I'm pretty literate. But those 3 people keep me totally in my place. Um, and Cornell's like that, but Cornell also uh, cares and always stands with the marginalized. I mean, he did not use his academic or intellectual brilliance to build a monument to himself. And so actually, when he was in there, the students begged him to come back and teach, and he did. I went with him. I just sat there, but he taught an intro to philosophy class. I mean, the guy has a Herculean schedule that would slay the rest of us, and yet he was coming down to that prison, to teach those prisoners. The thing with James Cone, as Cornell West said, in America there are 2 great black intellectuals who rose from dirt poor poverty. I mean, dirt poor poverty. One is Richard Wright, and the other is James Cone. Cone grew up, I mean, barefoot in segregated Arkansas, and he talks about how when it got dark, his father was a woodcutter. Just instinctively as a child, he knew that black men walking alone on roads at night in Arkansas in the 1930s often, might never come home. And he also understood how easy it was if you were black and poor, especially in the environment that he grew up in, to end up in prison or even on death row. So when James started speaking, he was, first of all, there were a row of corrections officers in the back. Almost all of them were white. I think they were all white, and I could see James get angry. And he just was prophetic. And I had students who were weeping as he spoke.
He was so moved as well.
He said to me, he said, I looked out at them and I said that could easily be me. He validated them. I mean, and just it was really moving and powerful. And the next night, I had one class after that, one more class, and I had one student who had been on death row, and he got up in class and he just, but when I walked in, he said, "You may have seen that I was crying last night when Dr. West and Dr. Cone spoke. I've been in the system since 1984, and the night that Dr. West and Dr. Cone came was the only happy night I've spent in prison." I sat down.
Yeah. And your sermon that ends the book is also very, very moving. You are moved by the experience, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically you thank the students. You thank them for giving you the opportunity of building a friendship with them. And you say that their friendship, that's the greatest gift that you could have ever received.
Well, of course.
Why was that? Why is that friendship so important to you?
Well, because I come from the other side of the divide. I come from white privilege. I go with money, but I went to all these elite institutions. I worked for the New York Times, and privilege, especially white male privilege, is a form of blindness. I learned that overseas. And no matter how hard you try, I speak Arabic. I spent 7 years in the Middle East, months of my life in Gaza. I always recognized that I would never fully understand what it meant to be a Palestinian living in the world's largest open-air prison. And in the same way, as hard as I tried, I would never understand what it meant, even though I lived in Roxbury for 2.5 years, what it meant to be poor and black in America. And if you honor that gap, if you are always cognizant of that inability to see, and that because of what privilege does, then you can build real relationships with people. That's what I did overseas, and that's what I did with my students.
And again, it's a human need, but we want to be accepted, right? We want to be recognized. We want to be seen as being on the same level as others.
Well, yes, although, if you look at the trajectory of my career, there were certainly moments when I wasn't accepted at all. When I denounced the call by the Bush administration to invade Iraq, and I'd been the Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times, I came in every morning and my phone messages were filled with death threats until the message, the answering mechanism was out of room. And I was booed off of a commencement stage.
The students tried to pull you off.
Yeah, at one point, students got up and tried. So there are times when we have to stand up and we're not accepted at all. And I'm not pretending that it's enjoyable or fun. It's difficult. The New York Times finally told me I was not allowed to speak publicly about the Iraq War, and I went into the paper, my hands were sweating, and I was given a formal written reprimand, and I knew I had a choice. I could pay fealty to my career, or I could betray my father. And I remember walking out of that building knowing my career was over there because I wasn't going to be quiet, and recognizing, I think articulating for the first time what it was that my father, through his own ministry, had given me, and that was freedom. That I didn't need the imprimatur of the New York Times to tell me who I was. I knew who I was. I was my father's son. And that truly is freedom.
I think it's Ella Baker who would always ask people, who are your people? You know who your people are.
Yeah, and that's why I love August Wilson so much, because he wants to remind us who our ancestors and who our people are. We can't know who we are if we don't listen to the voices of our ancestors. We can't. And the wider society is never going to give that narrative to us. And if the wider society, especially if you're poor and black, have all sorts of mechanisms to erase or whitewash that narrative. And so you have to do the hard work of finding out yourself.
You really honor your father throughout this book. You constantly refer to him. He passed away in 1995. He was clearly a model for you. What do you think he would have to say about this book and about what his son produced?
Well, I often say, it's my voice, but it's my father's words. And that in the Christian church, we call that resurrection. That there's, these invisible witnesses that have such a powerful force over us, who we can't betray, even in the case of the New York Times at the cost of my own career. And so you keep those people alive by holding fast to the values that they imparted to you. And that's our job to if you want to use Christian terminology, it's called bearing the cross. But there comes a day when you can't bear it anymore. And it's time for someone else to pick it up. And so I think that, of course, I remain fiercely devoted to the values that were imparted to me by my father. But also, I don't look at that as an obligation, but as a gift. That, again, as I said before, it was those values that gave me the freedom to be a complete individual outside of an institution. I mean, when I left the New York Times, I didn't know. I was looking for a job as a high school teacher. Fortunately, my books have sold, but I didn't know that was going to happen at the time. No other journalistic outlet was going to hire me. I could have been very happy being a high school teacher. I have huge respect for teachers. I would have taught English and coached track.
And boxed.
I don't do boxing anymore. I'll let you.
Well, one person, and we're going to wrap up soon, but one person who I know you have a tremendous amount of admiration for. I think I could say that you adore him. I think you adore James Baldwin. He's someone that you talk about often, and we know that Baldwin himself was a preacher a child preacher.
He was.
And I think you've said this, he said, like Baldwin said, I think something to the effect that, he left the pulpit in order to teach the gospel.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there's more gospel in Baldwin than
right.
just about any modern theologian, with the exception of James Cone, you're going to read.
Are you a missionary? Are you a missionary too? Is writing these books, is this your pulpit?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that it's about standing, as James said, with the crucified of the earth. That's what we're called to do. And that's why, most of my students are Muslim. And I speak Arabic. I spent a long time in the Middle East. I have tremendous respect for Islam. I'm not trying to convert anyone in the prison. But that's where I'm supposed to be. I had a wonderful student. He was incarcerated when he was 14 for a crime he didn't commit. He was actually, his parents were dead. His father died when he was 2. His mother died when he was 9. He was a 12-year-old living in an abandoned building in Camden, per capita, the poorest city in the United States. And he's hauled in by a bunch of detectives, forced to sign a confession. He can barely read it. He gets to court. They read it out. He tries to protest that he didn't do it. And he's a child, and they sentence him as an adult, and he's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. And there were 2 moments with Lawrence. The first was I taught a history class a few years later, he's always an A+ student. He just works so hard. And at the end of the class, everybody walked out, and he stayed behind for a minute, and he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do so that one day I can be a teacher like you. And he walks out. And through a wonderful public defender, Jennifer Saletti, he got a resentencing hearing, but he had no family. So I had to go. I went as his character witness, and then they won't release you unless you have an address. So I raised the money so that he had an apartment for a year and he could finish his college degree. And I'm sitting in the courtroom all day, and I don't put on a clerical collar, very rarely, probably a half dozen times. But I did for that day, for Lawrence. I'm sat all day in the courtroom. The end of the day, everybody had left because the cases were over, and he was the last one. And the sheriff's deputy opened the door and said, "Who's that effing minister?" And Lawrence said, "That's my pastor." And Lawrence is Muslim. And that was a very moving moment for me, because I don't want him to be anything other than he is. I want him to be Muslim. And yet I had done my job, I felt, as a Christian minister. That's what ministry is about. It is standing with the crucified. And just to put a happy ending on Lawrence's life, he did get out. He graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers, and he is now working as a community organizer for the Industrial Areas Foundation and driving my old car.
The book is called The Class: Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. The author is Chris Hedges. Chris, it's been a delight speaking with you. Thanks so much for spending some time.
And I'm sorry, it's probably me. I'm a total Luddite. I mean, my children all laugh at me every time I go on a computer. So I'm glad we hooked up. Thank you.
No, thanks so much. And also a special thank you to our audience who stayed, who were very, very patient and who endured my ragging of the puck, for half an hour. So thank you so much for enduring that. Thanks also to the organizers of this event. Thank you to the Ottawa Public Library and of course the good folks at Ottawa Writers Fest. I've been told that I should just remind people not to forget to join us for 2 virtual literary awards ceremonies for the Ottawa Book Awards on Wednesday, October 20th, between 6 and 7. And it's for the Bywords John New Love Poetry Award on, let me see here, did I miss it? Oh, okay, I'm not getting the date. I'm sorry. Maybe someone can help me out there with the date. But anyway, thank you so much. And Chris, once again, thanks so much.
Thanks for doing it.
Hopefully you'll come to Ottawa one day, and we'll maybe play some hockey, or we can even box. Maybe we'll box.
I know I'm too old to box. Boris took me in the gym to box. That was a big mistake.
Okay. All right then.
I just watch boxing.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks so
thank
much.
you all. Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good night. You take care.